Akron, Ohio, 1886. The largest oatmeal mill in the world is on fire. 8 stories of it. The mill the city called the Jumbo is burning against the sky, and the man who built it is standing in the street watching it go, and not one board of it is insured. I've gone back to this night more often than I can easily explain because of the man in the street, and because of what happened to him afterward, which was, in its own way, worse than the fire. His name was Ferdinand Schumacher. He had come from Germany with almost nothing and had taught an entire country to eat a grain it had always fed to its horses. And he had become the richest man in Akron doing it. The company that grew out of his ruined mills is still on your grocery shelf this morning, one of the most trusted names in America. His own name is on nothing at all. The wealthiest man in Akron stood and watched the largest oatmeal mill in the world burn to the ground in a single night, and not one board of it was insured. A man who taught America to eat oats was burned out, then voted out of the company he anchored, and today almost no one knows he existed. One of the men who built the empire gave away close to 70% of his income for more than 40 years so that his fortune went to missionaries instead of to his own children. The founding family ran the company for more than 100 years, then walked away in 1984, and there is no member of that family anywhere on the name today. At one point, the company lost well over $1 billion on a single bottled tea brand, close to $1.5 million for every day it owned it. In the year 2001, the whole company was swallowed by a maker of soda, mostly so the buyer could get its hands on a sports drink. The friendly face on the box is a man who was never born and will never die, and he has outlasted every real person who ever built the company. In its entire history, the company named Quaker has never had a single thing to do with the Quakers, and some of the actual Quakers are still writing letters politely asking for their name back. Every one of those things is in the record. None of them is the strangest part. This is the story of the family that built Quaker Oats, one of the most trusted names in America, out of a grain that Americans had always fed to their horses. It is also the story of how that name never belonged to them, or to any Quaker at all, so that the men who built the empire were burned out and voted out and forgotten, while a man in a costume who was never born stayed on the box and outlasted every one of them. And the company they made was finally swallowed whole by a maker of soda. I want to start on that street in Akron, with the fire and the uninsured mill, because everything that came afterward begins the moment the richest man in the city stood and watched his life's work burn. Before we go on, one quiet thing. Subscribing helps build a small community around work like this and rewards the hours that go into it. Chapter 1. The Burning Mill. Start with the fire, because the fire is where the whole shape of the thing first shows itself. In 1886, a fire tore through Ferdinand Schumacher's mills in Akron, and when it was over, the largest oatmeal operation in the world was gone. The great mill they called the Jumbo, 8 stories of it, that had at its peak turned out hundreds of thousands of pounds of oatmeal a day, was a black ruin. Schumacher was the wealthiest man in the city, a man who had built his fortune board by board over 30 years, and he had carried almost no insurance on any of it. The loss ran to somewhere between $600,000 and nearly $1 million in the money of the 1880s, which is to say, he lost, in a single night, very close to everything. That is the scene I keep returning to, not because the fire was the end of him, though it was the beginning of the end, but because of where that ground stands today. Go to Akron now and you can sleep in the ruins. The old mills and grain silos that survived the company's long life were not torn down. They were hollowed out and turned into a hotel, a place called Quaker Square. where a traveler can rent a round room inside a cylindrical grain bin and sleep the night in the belly of the machine that fed the country. Downstairs there is a gift shop, and in the gift shop there is oatmeal, and on the oatmeal there is a face. A round, kind, smiling face under a wide black hat. A man in the plain dress of a Quaker, white hair, a look of complete trustworthiness. He is on every canister, in every store in America. He was never a real person. He was never anyone at all. And Ferdinand Schumacher, who actually stood on that ground, who actually built those mills, who actually taught the country to eat the oats they are still selling in that gift shop, is on nothing. Not the box, not the building, not the brand. There is no statue. There is a plaque, if you look for it, and there is the ghost of his silos, comfortable now, air-conditioned, rented by the night. I find that difficult to walk past quickly. A man builds the largest mill of its kind on Earth, loses it in a fire, and a century and a half later strangers sleep peacefully inside the shell of it, under the smiling picture of a man who never lived, eating the food the real man invented, and not one of them has any reason to know his name. The building survived, the product survived, the name survived. The only thing that did not survive was the person, and he is the only part of the story that was ever actually true. That is the puzzle this whole account is built around. How does a company keep the mill, keep the recipe, keep the name, keep the face, and lose only the people? How does a fortune that big leave behind a fiction in a hat and forget the man in the street? There is an answer, and it offers no comfort, but it takes the whole of what follows to arrive at it honestly. For now, it is enough to notice the arrangement. The physical plant endured, converted. The commercial product endured, refined. The trademark endured, protected by law and worth, by some estimates, a very great deal. Everything endured except the human beings, who turned out to be the one part of the enterprise that could not be trademarked or rebuilt or rented by the night. Schumacher did not give up on the night of the fire. That is worth saying plainly, because it makes what came later sadder rather than simpler. He was in his 60s, and he set about rebuilding, and for a while he even managed it, though he never again held the country the way he had before the flames. The jumbo had been the wonder of the industry, and the industry did not wait for him to recover. While he was clearing rubble in Akron, other men were merging, combining, arranging the future of oats among themselves, and they were not sentimental about the oatmeal king. To answer that, you have to go back another 30 years, before the fire, before the fortune, to a young immigrant standing behind the counter of a small Akron grocery, grinding a grain that respectable people were ashamed to be seen eating. Chapter 2. The Oatmeal King. Ferdinand Schumacher came to America from the town of Chell in the old kingdom of Hanover, and he arrived with a plan that everyone around him thought was faintly ridiculous. He settled in Akron, Ohio in the 1850s and opened a grocery, and at the back of it, he began to grind oats. This does not sound like a revolution, and at the time, it did not look like one either. Oats, in the America of the 1850s, were animal feed. You gave them to horses. The Old English insult that oats were a grain the Scots were reduced to eating because they had nothing better still carried its sting, and a respectable American family did not want to be caught putting horse food on the breakfast table. When Schumacher first started selling ground oats to the people of Akron, the local papers made fun of him for it, and he kept grinding. He was a patient, stubborn, deeply religious man, and he had a conviction, unusual for the time, that a cheap and filling grain could feed working people better and more honestly than the thin, expensive diet the age offered them. He sold his oatmeal in bulk, by the barrel and the sack, to grocers and households, and slowly, Then, quickly, the idea caught. By the standards of the day, it was a strange thing to get rich on. But the timing turned out to be extraordinary. When the Civil War came, the Union Army needed to feed hundreds of thousands of men cheaply, and Schumacher's oatmeal was exactly the food for it. Orders poured in. What had been a grocer's side experiment became an industrial operation, and Ferdinand Schumacher became, in a matter of years, the largest oat miller in the country and the richest man in Akron. They called him the Oatmeal King, and the title was not a joke. He built mill after mill. He built the Empire Barley Mill, and then bigger works, and finally the enormous 8-story mill the city nicknamed the Jumbo. And at its height, his operation sold hundreds of thousands of pounds of oatmeal a day, and Akron itself became the center of the American oatmeal trade on the strength of what he had done. His temperance and his religion were of a piece with his business. He did not drink, he did not gamble, he distrusted debt and display, and he ran his mills the way he ran his life, plainly and without waste. He was not a warm man by most accounts, and not an easy partner, but he was, in the thing he cared about, almost visionary. He believed, decades before it was fashionable, that ordinary working people deserved food that was cheap, clean, and nourishing, and he had made a fortune proving that oats could be all three. There is a detail here that later chapters will need, so I will set it down now. Schumacher sold his oatmeal mostly in bulk, out of barrels and sacks, the way nearly everything was sold in those years. He was a miller to his bones, in love with the grain and the machinery of turning it into food. What he was not, and what would cost him more than the fire ever did, was a marketer. He thought the oats would speak for themselves, because to him they always had. I want to slow down here because this is the part that later disappears completely. Everything that Quaker Oats would ever become, the whole American habit of eating oats for breakfast, the entire market, was essentially conjured into being by this one stubborn German grocer who refused to stop grinding horse food. He did not inherit a market. There was no market. He made the country want a thing it had actively looked down on, and he did it a decade before there was any Quaker anything, any trademark, any man in a hat. And here is what almost no one remembers. He built all of it under his own name, F. Schumacher, the German Mills American Oatmeal Company. His name was on the mills, on the sacks, on the company. For a stretch of years in the 1870s and 1880s, the most important name in American oats was Schumacher, spelled out plainly. A real man's real name over a real business he had really built. It would not stay that way. In another Ohio town 100 miles off, a smaller miller was about to reach into an encyclopedia and pull out a name that would bury Schumacher's completely, and do it so thoroughly that the name Schumacher has all but vanished from the public memory. If you are finding this worth your time, a subscribe genuinely helps. It is the quiet difference between work like this getting made and not. And it is the only thing these stories ask of anyone. Chapter 3. The Borrowed Name. The name came out of a book. In the town of Ravenna, Ohio, there was a small firm called the Quaker Mill Company, and the story of how it got that name is one of the founding legends of American branding, though the record leaves two men fighting over the credit. By one account, a partner named Henry Seymour was paging through an encyclopedia, came across an entry on the Society of Friends, the people called Quakers, and decided that the qualities the article described, honesty, integrity, plain dealing, purity, were exactly the qualities he wanted the public to attach to a sack of oats. By another account, the other founder, a man named William Heston, chose the name himself, having been struck by a picture of William Penn, the most famous Quaker of them all. The sources do not agree, and I have not been able to settle it. What is not in dispute is the decision itself. They would name the oats after a religion. Neither of these men was a Quaker. The Society of Friends had nothing to do with the mill, nothing to do with the oats, nothing to do with the company then or ever. The name was chosen for exactly one reason, because the Quakers had spent 2 centuries building a reputation for being the most honest people in America. And that reputation was for sale, or rather, it was simply there to be taken, free, by anyone willing to print it on a label. In 1877, the Quaker Mill Company registered its trademark, the figure of a man in full Quaker dress, and by the company's own telling, it was the first trademark ever registered for a breakfast cereal in the United States. Whether or not it was truly the very first, the thing itself was a genuine innovation, and a strange one. It was a picture of a man who did not exist, wearing the clothes of a faith that had not consented, vouching for a product he had never seen. And it worked. It worked immediately, and it has worked ever since. The man in the hat was trust made visible, and he cost the company nothing to hire because he was no one, and because the people whose trust he was borrowing were never asked and were never paid. I think this is the true center of the whole story. So I want to sit with it. Ferdinand Schumacher built the American oat business under his own name, a real man vouching for his own real work. 100 miles away, 2 men who had built far less reached into an encyclopedia, borrowed the good name of a religion they did not belong to, hung it on a figure who never lived, and created something that would outlast Schumacher, outlast themselves, outlast the family that would run it for a century, and outlast the very company it was printed on. The honest man's name vanished. The borrowed name is immortal. The Quakers themselves, the actual Society of Friends, have never been comfortable with any of it, and over the years they have said so. They have written letters. They have objected to the ads. In our own time, a group of friends signed a letter asking the company to give up the name it had taken. The answer has always, in effect, been no. There is nothing they can do, because you cannot own the reputation of your own religion once someone else has printed it on a box. And no court was ever going to hand the word Quaker back to the Quakers. There is a small legal irony worth noting for those who like such things. The original registration rested on an early federal trademark law that the Supreme Court would strike down within a couple of years in the cases that reshaped how such marks were protected. So the paperwork of that first filing did not mean quite what the founding legend implies. But the mark itself survived every reshuffling of the law that followed, because by then it was simply too valuable and too well established to lose. The company has held some version of it unbroken ever since. And the objections have never entirely stopped. Across the generations, individual friends and friends' meetings have written to complain that the plain, honest people of their faith were being used, without permission, to move a commodity. In recent years, the objection was put formally and publicly, a request that the company retire a name it had no moral claim to. The company has kept the name. In fairness, the law was never in much doubt. But the question is a revealing one, because it shows the whole machine in miniature. A reputation was taken from people who had spent centuries earning it, printed on a package, and made into property that the people themselves could no longer touch. To understand why a name like that was worth so much, worth stealing, worth building an empire on, you have to understand what the grocery shelf looked like before it, in a country that did not yet trust anything that came sealed in a package with a stranger's promise on the front. Chapter 4. Horse food. For most of the 19th century, that buying food in America was an act of faith with very little to back it up. You went to a grocer, and the things you bought came loose, out of barrels and bins and open sacks. Flour, sugar, crackers, oats, all of it scooped out in front of you, its origin unknown, its quality whatever the merchant said it was, its purity a matter of hope. There were no sealed packages to speak of, no brands in the way we mean the word now, and very little law. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the first real federal attempt to guarantee that food was what it claimed to be, did not arrive until 1906. Before that, a barrel of oats might be clean or might be full of dust and grit and worse, and you found out at the table. Oats sat at the very bottom of this already low arrangement. They were, in the American mind, animal feed, and the association clung to them. To eat oats was to eat down, to admit you could not afford better, to put on your table the thing you fed to the horse in the barn. This was the prejudice Schumacher had spent his career grinding against, and it is the reason the whole thing was such an unlikely place to build a fortune. What the sealed, branded, trademarked package did was solve both problems at once, and it is hard, from here, to see how radical it was. A box of Quaker Oats was clean and sealed, and always the same. It did not vary from barrel to barrel or grocer to grocer. It carried a name and a face, and by carrying them, it made a promise that what was inside would be exactly what was inside the last one, and the next one, and every one after that. In a market built on hope and a merchant's word, that consistency was close to magic. The package was a contract. The face on the front was the signature. And this is the quiet genius of the borrowed name, the thing that makes it more than a marketing trick. The single hardest thing to sell in that era was trust in a stranger's food. So the company did not try to earn trust slowly, the way Schumacher had. One honest sack at a time under his own name. It bought the finished article, ready-made, from the one group of Americans who had spent 200 years becoming a byword for honesty. The Quaker on the box was not selling oats. He was selling the idea that this particular box would not cheat you, and he was doing it by wearing the clothes of the most famously incorruptible people in the country. By the standards of the period, it was an astonishing shortcut. Every other merchant was trying to convince you, personally, that his barrel was clean. Quaker Oats simply put a Quaker on the lid and let 2 centuries of somebody else's reputation do the work. It is one of the most effective things anyone has ever printed on a package, and it rested entirely on a name its owners had no right to and had never earned. Consider what the housewife of the 1880s actually faced. She could not read a nutrition label because there was none. She could not check a sell-by date because there was none. She could not sue if the flour was cut with chalk or the oats were half dust, not in any way that would help her that evening. She bought on the merchant's word and her own senses, and she was cheated often enough that suspicion was simply good sense. Into that world came a sealed box with a face on it that said, in effect, "This one will not cheat you." And the face belonged to the most trusted kind of person she could imagine. It was not a small thing. It was, for a great many families, the first food they had ever bought that came with a promise attached. And the promise, cynical as its origin was, largely held. The oats really were clean. They really were the same every time. The borrowed name was doing dishonest work, but it was selling an honest product, and that combination turned out to be almost unbeatable. Which raises the question of who took that borrowed name and turned it from a clever trick into a national institution. Because Schumacher, the honest man with his own name on his own mills, did not do it. The man who did was a salesman from Cleveland who understood something about the American public that Schumacher never did. Hit subscribe if you want the next of these. It costs nothing, and it means the story finds its way back to you. Chapter 5. The Autocrat. Henry Parsons Crowell was 26 years old when he bought a bankrupt oat mill in Ravenna, Ohio, and with it, the right to the name that would make him one of the most important marketers in American history. He was born in Cleveland in 1855 into money and lost his father to tuberculosis young, and was told as a boy that he had weak lungs himself and might not live long. He spent years traveling for his health, and somewhere in that long, uncertain young manhood, he made a private religious vow that would define everything he did afterward, that if he were allowed to prosper, he would treat the money as God's rather than his own. Few industrialists keep a promise like that. Crowell kept it with a thoroughness that is genuinely startling, and it is the reason his story bends so strangely away from everyone else's in this account. In 1881, he bought the failed Quaker Mill Company, name, trademark, and all. And where Schumacher was a miller, a man in love with the grain and the grinding, Crowell was something newer, and for the purposes of history, more dangerous. He was a marketer. He understood, earlier and more completely than almost anyone of his generation, that in a country full of anonymous barrels, the name was the product. The oats were oats. The name was the fortune. So he spent on the name. He ran some of the first national magazine advertising for any packaged food. He put recipes directly on the package, so the box taught you how to use what was inside it. He pushed the Quaker man into every kitchen and every publication he could reach, made him familiar, made him trusted, made him ordinary in the best sense. A face you had simply always known. What Schumacher had built with mills, Crowell built with attention. He took the borrowed name and made it, through sheer relentless repetition, into one of the most recognized images in the country. The methods were, for the 1880s and 90s, close to inventions in themselves. He advertised nationally at a scale few had attempted for a food product, in the big circulation magazines that were themselves new. He printed cooking directions and recipes on the carton so that the package did not merely hold the oats, but taught the buyer what to do with them, which built the habit that built the market. He experimented with samples and premiums, small rewards tucked in or promised, so that buying the box felt like receiving something. He treated the Quaker man not as a logo to be filed away, but as a character to be kept constantly, patiently in front of the public until he became part of the furniture of American life. Schumacher had made the country willing to eat oats. Crowell made it reach without thinking for one particular box of them. I want to be careful here not to make him a villain, because he was not one. And the truth about him is stranger and more interesting than a villain would be. This man who built his fortune on a borrowed religious name was himself privately, ferociously religious. And he did with his money something almost no one else in this whole account did. He gave it away. For more than 40 years, by the accounts that survive, Henry Crowell gave away something close to 70% of his income, year after year, to Christian missions and Bible institutes and religious causes. His name today is not on a food empire. It is on a trust that still gives money away, and on a building at a Bible college in Chicago. He built the brand and then deliberately declined to build a dynasty on it. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the second erasure, and the strangest one, since this time the man did it to himself. Schumacher lost his name to a fire and a proxy fight against his will. Crowell, who arguably did more than anyone to make the Quaker name a household word, arranged his own disappearance from the fortune, on purpose, out of conviction, and routed the money to missionaries so that no Crowell heir would sit atop the empire he had made. 2 of the 3 men most responsible for Quaker Oats, and neither of them left a family on it. One was pushed off, one stepped off. The name stayed, and the men did not. There was a third force, though, a family that did stay, that ran the company not for a decade, but for a century, out in Iowa, far from Akron and Ravenna and the fire. And to understand how even they finally left, and left nothing, you have to go west to Cedar Rapids and meet the Stewarts. Chapter 6. The family in Cedar Rapids. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, sits on a bend of the river of the same name, in the flat, generous farm country of the eastern part of the state, and it was there, from the 1870s onward, that the family who would actually run Quaker Oats for 100 years quietly set up their mills. They were the Stewarts, and they came to it the way a great many American fortunes were made, by moving. John Stewart was a miller of Scottish stock who had worked in Canada, and his son Robert established an oat mill at Cedar Rapids, Iowa in the 1870s. Before long, the Stewarts, together with a partner named George Douglas, had built their milling into one of the more formidable operations in the country. They were not, at the start, the biggest name in oats. That was Schumacher, off in Akron, and after him the aggressive marketers in Ravenna. The Stewarts were something steadier and, in the long run, more durable. They were operators. They ran mills, and they ran them well, and they kept running them while the louder men rose and fell around them. When the great consolidation came, which is the subject of the next chapter, it was the Stewarts and Henry Crowell who ended up holding the top of the combined company. And it was the Stewarts who stayed. Robert Stewart and then his descendants held senior leadership of the enterprise across the generations. And the Cedar Rapids works grew and grew until it could fairly be called the largest cereal mill in the world, a plant of a scale that matched the ambition of the name on the box. The family gave the company its longest thread of continuity. From the founding of the modern corporation at the turn of the century until the early 1980s, there was almost always a Stewart near the center of it, and a Douglas not far off. What is striking, reading their long tenure now, is how little noise they made in it. The great industrial families of the age tended to become public figures, their names on foundations and universities and scandals, their faces in the papers. The Stewarts, by and large, did not. They ran the largest cereal operation on earth from an Iowa river town, generation after generation, with a discretion that bordered on invisibility. They were not building a monument to themselves. They were running a business, and the business already had a face, and the face was better than any of theirs because it belonged to no one who could ever embarrass it. Here is the part worth turning over. In all that time, across more than 100 years and 3 or 4 generations of them, the Stewarts never once put their own name on the company. They could have. Men of far smaller achievements stamped themselves on their firms without a second thought, the way Schumacher had, the way Heinz and Hershey and Ford did. The Stewarts ran the largest oat operation on earth, and they were content to run it under the picture of a man in a hat who had never lived, a name lifted from a religion none of them belonged to. They stewarded the fiction faithfully for a century, and they left it exactly as they had found it, borrowed. This was not modesty exactly, though there may have been some of that. It was a kind of clear-eyed commercial sense that Schumacher never had, and that Crowell had taught the whole company by example. The name was the asset. The name was worth more than any real family's name could ever be, because the name was already, from birth, a promise of honesty that no actual human being could match. A Stewart on the box would have been just a man. The Quaker on the box was an idea, and ideas do not age or drink or make bad heirs or die. So they left it alone, and they prospered. And for 100 years, the arrangement held. A real family in Iowa ran a real empire under a stranger's borrowed name. And it worked so well that the family's own name faded almost as completely as Schumacher's. Ask most Americans who ran Quaker Oats, and they will have no answer. Because the whole design of the thing was that no person should stand between the buyer and the man in the hat. To understand how the Stewarts came to sit at the top of it in the first place, and what it cost the man they replaced, you have to go back to the wars among the millers in the years just after the fire. Subscribing is how accounts like this keep finding their way to you. It is free, and it is the whole of what these ask. Chapter 7. The Oatmeal Wars. By the middle of the 1880s, the American oat business had a problem that the men inside it understood perfectly and could not solve, which was that they were very good at making oatmeal and very bad at making money from it. The trouble was success. Schumacher and the others had proven that oats could be sold to the whole country, and so mill after mill had been built to meet the demand. And soon, there was far more milling capacity than the market could absorb. The result was the classic agony of the age, a price war with no bottom. Everyone made too much, everyone cut prices to move it, and everyone bled. It was the same disease that was driving the oil men and the steel men and the sugar men toward combination in exactly these years, the age of the great trusts. And the oat men reached for the same cure. If competition was ruinous, then the answer was to stop competing. Combine, set the price, share the market, survive. That logic was sound, and the execution was brutal. Combination meant that some mills would close, and some men would lose their independence, and every miller wanted it to be some other miller. The negotiations were less a merger than a slow siege. Each operator maneuvering to enter the combine on the best terms and to leave his rivals on the worst. And a man's standing going in depended entirely on how strong his position was at the table. Schumacher, a decade earlier, would have negotiated from the head of the industry. After the fire, he negotiated from weakness, and everyone in the room knew it. A first attempt came in 1886, the very year of the Akron fire, when a group of the major millers formed the Consolidated Oatmeal Company to try to bring order to the chaos. It was loose and it strained, and by 1888, it had been reorganized into something larger and more formal, the American Cereal Company, which pulled the important mills, Schumacher's among them, under a single corporate roof. On paper, it was a triumph. The scattered oat business gathered into one great enterprise. In practice, it was a cage full of men who had spent their careers trying to destroy one another and now had to share a boardroom. Schumacher was in that boardroom, and for a time he was near the head of the table, an old lion still, the man whose name had built the whole trade. But the fire had weakened him, financially and in standing, and he was not a man who shared power gracefully or hid his contempt for those he thought lesser millers and mere salesmen. Ranged against him were the newer men, chief among them Henry Crowell, the marketer from Ravenna, and the steady operators from Cedar Rapids. They understood the modern company in a way Schumacher did not. They understood proxies and votes and the quiet arithmetic of control. And around the end of the 1890s, they used it. In the corporate maneuvering inside the American Cereal Company, Ferdinand Schumacher, the oatmeal king, the man without whom none of them would have had an industry to fight over, was outvoted and pushed out of the company he had anchored. There was no fire this time, no dramatic night, nothing to photograph. There was a proxy fight and a board vote, and at the end of it, the founder of the American oat business no longer controlled any part of it. By the standards of the boardroom, it was a clean and ordinary defeat. By any older standard, it was the killing of a king by men who had inherited a kingdom they did not build. The final act came in 1901, when the whole enterprise was reorganized once more and incorporated in New Jersey under the name it still carries, the Quaker Oats Company, with sales that already stood at some $16 million. It rose on the foundation of the mills that Schumacher had built and lost, and it carried the borrowed name of the Ravenna men, and the family that would run it belonged to neither story. Schumacher's mills, Crowell's name, the Stewarts' management. The one thing the new company did not carry anywhere on it was the name of the man who had made America eat oats in the first place. It is worth pausing on how ordinary the paperwork of this was. A charter filed in New Jersey, a capital stated, a board named, shares issued. There is nothing in the documents that records a founding being erased, because as far as the documents are concerned, nothing was erased. A new corporation was formed, and older assets were folded into it, and the older assets happened to include the mills and the trade and the market that one man had spent his life building. The law does not have a line for the theft of a legacy, because no law was broken. Everything was done correctly. That is precisely what makes it worth looking at. He was still alive to see it. That is the hardest part of it, and it is where we have to go back to the fire. Chapter 8. What the fire took. Return then to the burning mill, because we can finally see now what it really cost. And the true loss was not the building. The fire of 1886 did not kill Ferdinand Schumacher. That is the cruelty of it. If it had, he would have died the oatmeal king, the richest man in Akron, mourned as the founder of an industry. Instead, it left him alive and diminished, a wealthy man suddenly and enormously poorer, uninsured, in his 60s, facing the work of rebuilding an empire from ash at an age when most men are handing theirs to their sons. He tried. He was too stubborn not to try. But the fire had opened a wound that the oatmeal wars would finish, and the men who combined the industry in the years afterward did their work on a Schumacher who was already bleeding. By the accounts that survive, his last years were a long descent from the top of the city. The fortune thinned. There were assignments to creditors, the machinery of a man's affairs being handed over to other people to settle. The oatmeal king, who had watched the largest mill in the world burn and had gotten up the next morning to rebuild it, ended his life a figure of the past, respected in Akron in the way you respect a monument, and largely unknown beyond it. He died in 1908, 22 years after the fire, and 7 years after the company that rose from his mills took its final name and declined to put his anywhere on it. Consider the arithmetic of that erasure, because it is exact. He built the American oat trade across the 1860s and 70s. He lost the mill in 1886. He was pushed from the company around the end of the 1890s. The company took its permanent name in 1901. He lived on until 1908. For the better part of a decade then, an old man walked around Akron, while the enterprise he had founded prospered a few miles away under a name that was not his, sold behind a face that was not real, run by men who had voted him out. He got to watch his own forgetting happen in real time, and there was nothing whatever he could do about it. I have gone looking for what remains of him, and there is not much. A grave, a plaque or two in Akron, which still remembers him more kindly than the country does. A paragraph in the histories, when there is a paragraph at all. The mills he built became the property of a company that carried a stranger's face, and the silos he raised became, in the end, a hotel. He gave America a food it still eats every single morning. And the thanks the record offers him is a footnote, and a converted grain bin. There is a temptation, standing over a life like this, to reach for the language of villains, to look for the man who did this to him. But there is no single villain, and that is part of what makes it hard to hold. The fire was an accident, or at most a carelessness with grain dust that 100 mills shared. The men who voted him out were doing what the modern corporation invites men to do, which is to count votes and act on the count. The company that dropped his name was simply choosing the more valuable name, as any company would. No one in the chain did anything that the age did not consider ordinary and shrewd. The erasure of Ferdinand Schumacher was not a crime. It was a series of reasonable decisions, each defensible on its own, that added up to the disappearance of a man. And that is a more unsettling thing than a crime, because there is no one to blame and nothing that would be done differently. This is the thing to hold up to the light, because it is the whole shape of the story in a single life. The fire took the mill for one night. The company took the man forever. And of those two losses, only the first was ever mourned. Only the first was ever called a disaster. Only the first was ever photographed and remembered as a great Akron calamity. The second loss, the slow erasure of the founder while his own invention thrived without him, happened so quietly and over so many years that no one thought to grieve it. And by the time it was complete, there was no one left who remembered there had been anything to grieve. He built it under his own name. He lost it to a fire he could have insured against, and to men he could not outvote. And the name that replaced his was not even a real one. There is a comfortable ending you could tell from here, in which the company he founded went on to a long and prosperous century. And in a sense, that ending is even true. But it is not his ending. And the century that followed carried its own quiet erasures, all the way to the two decisions at the very end that took the company itself. If you have come this far, you are the person these are made for. A subscribe keeps them coming, and it costs you nothing at all. Chapter 9. The Drink. The end of the family's long leadership and the beginning of the end of the company fell within a year of each other, in the early 1980s. In 1984, the last of the Stewarts at the center of the enterprise, Robert Douglas Stewart, Jr., who had run the company for years, stepped down to serve as an ambassador abroad, closing a thread of continuity that ran back through the whole life of the modern company. And the year before, in 1983, Quaker Oats, now a large and diversified corporation with far more on its shelves than oatmeal, had made the purchase that would define its future more than any cereal ever had. It bought a company called Stokely Van Camp. And the reason it wanted Stokely Van Camp was a sports drink that had been invented years earlier by researchers for a college football team in Florida to replace what the players sweated out in the heat. The drink was Gatorade. The price is given variously in the accounts, but it was somewhere around $220 million, and it would turn out to be one of the shrewdest acquisitions in the history of the American food business. Gatorade grew and grew, dominated its category so completely that its name became the ordinary word for the entire kind of drink, and became in time worth many times what Quaker had paid for the whole company that came with it. For once, the company had bought a real thing and not a borrowed name, and the real thing turned out to be the most valuable asset it had ever owned. That is the irony that organizes the whole final act. The company that was built on a fiction was, at the close of its independent life, saved and then sold entirely because of the one genuinely substantial thing it had ever managed to acquire. Hold on to Gatorade because it is the hinge. Everything after this turns on it. If the story of Quaker Oats in the 20th century's first half was patient and steady, the story of its final years was the opposite. A corporation making large and increasingly risky bets in a food market that had grown restless. The one that broke it came in 1994. Flush with the success of Gatorade, the company decided to repeat the trick and bought another beverage brand. The bottled teas and juices sold under the name Snapple, and it paid an enormous sum for it, roughly $1.7 billion. It was, almost immediately, a catastrophe. The two businesses did not fit. The distribution fought itself. The brand that had thrived on quirk and independence withered inside a large corporation, and the value bled out of it week after week after week. 3 years later, in 1997, Quaker Oats sold Snapple for about $300 million. It had paid $1.7 billion and sold for $300 million, a loss of well over $1 billion in 36 months, which works out, if you care to do the arithmetic, to something close to $1.5 million for every single day the company owned it. The chief executive who had championed the deal, William Smithburg, did not survive it. He resigned the same year. A company that had endured a founder's ruin, a fire, panics, price wars, 2 world wars, and a century of change had been brought to its knees by a bottled tea. The books never recovered their footing. The board had watched more than $1 billion evaporate in 3 years, and it had watched the market punish the company for it. And from that point on, Quaker Oats was no longer quite the master of its own future. It was a wounded thing carrying one extremely valuable organ. And in a market full of predators, a wounded thing carrying something valuable does not stay independent for long. And that, finally, is what put it in play. A weakened Quaker Oats, its great prize still the sports drink it had bought in 1983, became a target. And in the year 2001, the target was taken. PepsiCo, the soft drink and snack food giant, bought the Quaker Oats company outright in a deal valued at roughly $13 billion. And by most accounts, the thing it wanted above all, the jewel it was really paying for, was Gatorade. The oats, the man in the hat, the century of history, the ghost of Schumacher, all of it came along in the bargain, the way a house comes with the land you actually wanted. So the company that a German grocer conjured out of horse food, that a marketer built into a household name, that a family in Iowa ran for 100 years, ended its independent life as a line item in the accounts of a company that makes soda, acquired chiefly so that the soda maker could own a drink invented for a football team. There was no fire this time either. There is never a fire the second time. There is only a vote, and a price, and a name passing quietly into the possession of people who had nothing to do with building it. Which leaves the last question, the one this whole account has been walking toward. When the founders are forgotten, and the family is gone, and the company itself belongs to someone else, what exactly is left? And the answer is the strangest part of all. Chapter 10, The Man Who Never Was. What is left is a man who was never born. Go through the whole of it and count what survived. The Quaker religion is not in Quaker Oats, and never was. Ferdinand Schumacher, who built the industry, is a plaque and a footnote. Henry Crowell, who built the brand, gave his fortune to missionaries and left no dynasty on it. The Stuarts, who ran it for a century, walked away in 1984 and put their name on nothing. The company itself stopped being an independent thing in 2001 and became a possession of a maker of soda. Every real person, every real family, every real institution in the story either left or was pushed out, or gave itself away or was forgotten. And through all of it, unchanged, untroubled, and by now worth more than any of the real people ever were, the man in the hat remained. He has been redrawn over the years, softened and modernized by artists who were paid to keep him current, given a name by the public that the company never officially gave him, slimmed and brightened for changing tastes. But he has never been replaced, and he has never left the box, and he has never once been a person. He is the single most durable thing anyone in this whole account ever made, and he is the only one of them who was never real. The actual Quakers, the living Society of Friends, have watched this for a century and a half with a patience that is almost its own kind of rebuke. They have written their letters, they have registered their objections. In our own time, a group of them put the request in writing, asking the company to give up the name it had taken from their faith. The company kept the name. There was never any real chance it would do otherwise. A reputation, once it has been printed on enough boxes, stops belonging to the people who earned it and starts belonging to whoever owns the trademark. And no letter, however patient, has ever changed that. Let me stop the chronology here because the chronology is finished, and what is left is not a date, but a question of what the whole thing means. It would be easy to make this a story about loss, a gentle American tragedy, a good, honest founder ruined, and a simpler time swallowed by big corporations and bottled tea. That is the reading I want to push against, because it is too soft, and it lets the thing off too lightly. This is not a tragedy about the past. It is a plain description of how the present was built, which is that the most valuable thing a company can own is not a mill, or a recipe, or even a family, but a name that promises something the company itself never has to be. What strikes me, coming back to it, is how completely the fiction won. I went into this expecting a story about a family that lost its company. And that is in there, the Stewarts and their 100 quiet years. But the deeper story is about a man who never existed, outlasting every man who did. Schumacher was real and is forgotten. Crowell was real and gave himself away. The Stewarts were real and are gone. The Quaker on the box was never real for a single day, and he is the last one standing, still smiling, still selling, still promising an honesty that no living person in the whole account was ever allowed to keep. What survived then was the name and the face. What did not survive was every person attached to them. What survived was the mill, converted into a hotel. What did not survive was the man who built it, except as a plaque you would have to go looking for. What survived was the promise printed on the box. What did not survive was anyone who ever had to keep it. Go back to Akron. Stand again on the ground where the Jumbo burned in 1886, where the richest man in the city watched the largest oatmeal mill in the world go up, uninsured. The mill is still there, in a manner of speaking. The silos still stand. But they are a hotel now, and travelers sleep soundly inside the grain bins. And down in the gift shop, the oats are still for sale in Ohio, with the same kind smiling face on the canister that there has always been. The fire took the mill for a single night. Everything else the company took, or gave away, or forgot. And the friendly man in the wide black hat, the one who was never born and cannot die, is still there on the box in the lobby, selling a grain a country once fed to its horses, under a name that never belonged to a single living soul in this entire account, watching over an empire of ash and silos and borrowed trust. The last one left, exactly because he was the only one who was never there to lose. This is what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.